There are many very popular Hollywood movies about people, both based on real stories and fiction, who survive terrible situations. Why do we enjoy survivor tales so much? Well, maybe it's just the human drama of people who only seem to be on the edge of disaster. Maybe we want to imagine what we would do in the same situation. Maybe it just helps us to appreciate our own cozy and relatively safe lives. In 1630, a little remembered group of 8 Englishmen became separated from their ship and were left virtually without equipment and supplies in one of the world's harshest environments to almost certain death. And yet they survived to tell the tale. And what a tale it was.
Much of the early exploration of the Arctic came in an effort to find a northeast passage, a new trade route to the wealth of the Orient, a path that was never found as the Arctic proved to be far too dangerous. Chartered by the English crown in 1555, the Mystery and Company of Merchant Adventurers for the Discovery of Region, Dominions, Islands, and Places Unknown, later known as the Muscovy Company, was created for the purpose of finding the Northeast Passage, but had instead found something else of value. In 1610, the company sent Captain Jonas Poole to explore the Svalbard Islands, midway between the northern coast of Norway and the North Pole. There he reported a great store of whales near the islands. Whaling became a major industry for England and the Dutch in the 17th century, especially in a rush for new Arctic sources, which had been essentially untouched. Whaling had grown into a massive industry in the 1500s, when it was mostly practiced by Basque whalers who had been hunting whales for at least centuries. By 1613, the Muscovy Company held a monopoly chartered from King James I, which brought them into conflict with Dutch, French, and Basque ships in the area. King James claimed sovereignty over the islands. The various Europeans competed for whales, but more especially for good anchorages on the slang of Spitsbergen. Competition occasionally even turned to bloodshed, as it did in 1618 when Dutch ships fired on English ones, killing several men. James agreed to allow the Dutch to whale on the island for the following 3 seasons, but the English attempted to expel the Dutch twice in the 1620s. Multiple stations were eventually established by the various powers. One of the Muscovy Company's most important whaling captains of the era was William Goodlad, who, according to Thomas Edge, an employee of the Muscovy Company, was admiral of the English whaling fleet from 1620 to 1622. It was a dangerous place. According to a letter reprinted in 1625, Goodlad's brother Peter was lost on June 28, 1623, when he was pulled from a boat by a harpooned whale. Goodlad, aboard the warship Hercules, had fought a battle with whaling ships from Hull and York, successfully forcing them to leave the island. Though whaling at Spitsbergen was well established by 1631, no one overwintered there. Fleets sailed to the island, hunted whales, and collected oil, and then they returned home for the winter. Getting left on the island would have been a death sentence, 560 miles north of the Arctic Circle. And yet that is exactly what happened in 1630, when a small ship was lost on a routine whaling mission. In May of 1630, the Salutation left England with 2 other ships, bound for Spitsbergen on behalf of the Muscovy Company to hunt whales. Aboard the ships was Edward Pelham, a gunner's mate. The Salutation was commanded by Goodlad, who once again was admiral of the fleet. In Pelham's account, he refers to the island as Greenland, a common English name for the island, but somewhat confusing to modern audiences who associate the name with the much larger island to the east. They arrived at Spitsbergen on June 11th. Whaling at Spitsbergen involved hunting whales from shallops, small, highly maneuverable ships that were double-ended, meaning that they had points at both bow and stern. At Spitsbergen, they hunted bowhead whales, an interesting whale with the largest mouth of any animal, making up almost a third of their 10 to 17-foot length. They are especially known for their large triangular head, resembling a ship bow, which they used to break through Arctic ice. The 3 ships split up when they arrived, with the Salutation staying at the foreland where they first arrived, while the other ships traveled elsewhere. Pelham's ship ended up staying near the Salutation at Bell Sound on the west side of the island. According to Pelham, his shallop was from one of the other ships, but was ordered to stay with Salutation to make the fleet so much the stronger for the defense of the merchants' goods homeward bound, the Dunkirkers being very strong and rife at sea in those days. Dunkirkers, subject of another episode of the History Guy, were pirates that especially targeted merchant ships of the English and Dutch fleets, because don't all good stories involve pirates? On August 8th, the ship sailed south towards Green Harbor to meet with the ship that Pelham had originally left, but the wind being contrary, our ship could no way lie our course. Finally, on a clear day, Goodlad sent out a shallop with 8 men. The aforementioned Pelham, along with William Fakeley, gunner, John Wise and Robert Goodfellow, seamen, Thomas Ayers, whale cutter, Henry Bett, cooper, and John Dawes and Richard Kellett, landmen. Landmen were inexperienced sailors, likely on their first voyage, and largely used as rowers. They also brought with them a brace of dogs, meaning a pair. The 8 were sent landward to secure some venison from the Svalbard reindeer, unique to the Svalbard archipelago. Pelham also notes the supplies they carried: a snap hance, which is a kind of gun, 2 whaling lances, about 5 or 6 feet long with long iron ends, and a tinderbox. Their hunt was successful, and they took 14 reindeer. They chose to spend the night on land before returning to the ship the following morning. But the following morning the weather turned, and a southward wind brought a considerable amount of ice, forcing the shallop to work its way well around, and in the process losing sight of the ship. Concerned that the salutation might be enclosed in ice anyway, they chose instead to follow the shore to Green Harbor, where they could meet Goodlad. When they arrived at Green Harbor, they found no ships. This surprised Pelham and the men, as they knew they had not victuals sufficient for the return journey. They had 3 days before they were supposed to leave the island for England, so they turned immediately to sail back to Bell Sound in the hopes of finding the fleet there. In that interest, they threw all their reindeer overboard. Finding their way back proved difficult. As Pelham notes, they didn't have a compass or an experienced pilot, and were fain to grapple in the dark like a blind man for his way, and overshot Bell Sound. Confused and beginning to panic, they sailed about searching eventually, according to Pelham, turning away from Bell Sound when they got within only a few miles, which one action was the main and only cause of our too late repentance, although Pelham blames Fakeley for the error and says that he never gave consent unto their counsel. On the 21st, they finally reached the mouth of the sound. By now they had missed their deadline, but they went ashore and sent men to the camp to see if the ships remained. They didn't. Now truly marooned, they had only a few options: try to sail in their small boat or stay at Bell Sound. Staying, Pelham said, promised only a miserable and a pining death. Well, we knew that neither Christian nor heathen people had ever before inhabited this desolate and untemperate climates. Pelham says he was wrong, as natives of northern Greenland lived as far north, but he couldn't know that. Pelham describes several tales that he says frightened him and his companions. First, that despite efforts to attempt the overwintering, no one had ever volunteered before. Second, a story that several condemned prisoners had been promised reprieve if they overwintered on the island, but had outright refused upon seeing the island. And third, that Goodlad had actually stranded 9 men on the island before, who all died miserably and whose bodies were eaten by bears and foxes. There appears to be no corroborating evidence for Pelham's tales. If there were 9 other stranded men, they appear in no known reports from the Muscovy Company or elsewhere. But even if the story wasn't true, Pelham and the others had little hope for a better fate. Understand their position. They had no supplies, little equipment. The island had a substantial population of polar bears. Any hope of rescue would be at the end of a long and deadly winter. Pelham wrote, "We were not only unprovided both of clothes to keep us warm and of food to prevent the cruel wrath of famine, but utterly destitute also we were of a sufficient house." In the end, they really had no choice, and they considered the problem of survival. "It pleased God to give us hearts like men," Pelham wrote. They first sailed back to Green Harbor, where they hunted reindeer and bears. They found a second shallop there and took both back to Bell Sound, where a storm sunk both. They rushed into the stormy seas to secure as much of their provisions as possible, and both of the shallops were recovered and pulled ashore. They found a Flemish house, which they called the Tent, which was built of timber board and very substantially, about 80 by 50 feet. The house was normally for the coopers, who would live in it while constructing barrels for whale oil. They deconstructed other nearby structures, another smaller cabin, and the furnaces used to boil whale blubber to build a smaller house within the larger. They made mortar, which they had to keep from freezing by the use of 2 fires. They built a 20 by 16-foot house within the larger one and vented chimney smoke into the larger space as well. They built 4 rooms inside, 2 men to a room, and used the skins of the reindeer as their bed. They kept the fire going day and night for 8 months straight. In the meantime, they hunted what they could: walruses, which they called seahorses, and bears. They rationed their food, fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays. On those days, they ate fritters or greaves of whale, That is, the scraps of fat of the whale, which are flung away after the oil is gotten out of it. Pelham called it a very loathsome meat. They had little in the way to distract them. Mostly, Pelham describes them complaining of their miseries, fearing for their families, and in turns cursing Goodlad and fearing that he had died somehow. The winters in Spitzbergen can be bitterly cold, typically around -15 or -20 degrees Celsius, roughly 5 degrees to -4 degrees Fahrenheit, but with much colder periods common. The island is also especially windy, thanks to pressure systems colliding with polar air. Worse, the whale fritters had molded with wet, and after 3 months they were forced to ration further to only 3 meals a week, besides the fritters. They also complained of the dark, even the glorious sun, as if unwilling to behold our miseries, masking his lovely face from us. He says they saw no sun at all between October 14th and February 3rd. Pelham tracked the date by observing the phases of the moon. Using some scrap lead, leftover oil, and rope yarn, they made themselves some rudimentary lamps to light their cabin. After January 1st, Pelham says the cold became extreme, causing their skin to raise blisters, and that if they touched any iron, it would stick to our fingers like bird lime. At the end of January, the sun was coming up again, and they found that their food again would not last until the ships came in May. On February 3rd, they left the cabin in hopes of finding something to hunt and came upon a she-bear and her cub. When the bear saw them, she cast her greedy eyes upon us and made the more haste onto us in the hopes of killing them. Pelham says the bear, once killed, gave them meat for 20 days. Unfortunately, though, eating her liver caused their skins to peel off. This is because polar bear livers have heavy concentrations of vitamin A, which isn't water-soluble, and in addition to making skin peel off, causes other severe poisoning symptoms. Their tent was apparently enticing to the bears. Pelham claims that some 40 bears came to the house, and they killed 7, including a wonderful great bear 6 foot height at least. This allowed them not only to eat every day, but even 2 or 3 meals a day, greatly increasing their strength. They did lose one of their 2 dogs, mastiffs, in March. It left the house and simply never returned. They also captured birds and foxes. By May, the remaining dog had grown so fat and lazy it couldn't pull down a reindeer they found. On May 25th, the first whaling ships arrived from Hull and sent a shallop into the Sound, hoping to discover if the men left behind the year before had survived. Clothes tattered and all black as we were with the smoke, they shared their food with the Hull men. They happily left the tent for the comparative comfort of the Hull whaling ships. On May 28th, the Muscovy Company fleet finally arrived. Despite cursing him when they were reunited with Goodlad, Pelham sung his praises, calling him the right noble captain and writing he is worthy to be honored by all seamen for his courtesy and bounty. But the men who went aboard one of the other ships were declared runaways and badly treated. But their greatest victory was survival. After 9 months and 12 days, all 8 men had survived, at a location further north than any earlier reported overwintering in the Arctic. Pelham published an account of their time marooned, entitled God's Power and Providence, shewed in the miraculous preservation and deliverance of 8 English men left by mischance in Greenland, anno 1630, 9 months and 12 days.
The only source we have for detail on the men's survival is Pelham's book, and he did have reasons to exaggerate because he was trying to sell books. But by any standard, their survival was extraordinary, heck, perhaps miraculous, especially since they did so with the loss of only 1 dog. An expedition in 1596 under Dutch explorer William Barents actually discovered Spitzbergen Island, but later became stuck in the ice and had to overwinter, and 5 of the 17 members of the expedition died, including Barents himself. When in 1620 an expedition under the Danish explorer Jens Munk was forced to overwinter in Manitoba, Canada, 61 of the 64 members of the expedition died. Other expeditions, like famously the Franklin expedition of 1845, were lost with all hands. How long do you think you would survive trapped in the Arctic? Why do you think we are so compelled by these stories of unlikely survival? Feel free to let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.